Okay, so today what we're talking about is spark plugs. Now, spark plugs are one of those commonly debated topics on any forum or car enthusiast group or whatever, and that's because spark plugs are a technology that's been around since basically the advent of the internal combustion engine. They need no introduction, and if you have no idea what a spark plug is, I really recommend that you learn. Didn't mean to giggle. Now, these are the factory 2.0T spark plugs from a 2010. Now, this should be a common spark plug up until the 2013s, in which case Hyundai actually switched to a different spark plug. And if I am to understand the differences correctly, it is simply a one-step colder plug than this on the 2013. So, if you want a spark plug that is known to be good for about 330 horsepower, then you can buy a 2013 spark plug for your 2010 and it will work. There's no difference in the head and there's no difference in the top deck. We have a pent roof combustion chamber, which means that the roof makes like a little steeple effect. So these are the cylinder walls. The roof makes a little steeple effect, okay? Now, we'll talk a little bit about the specs of the factory ones before we talk about the shiny ones. The factory ones are a 14mm thread. They are a flat gasket type mating surface. They have a 26.5mm reach, and that is this distance here. They use a 5/8 hex size, which is this bolt pattern, I guess you could say, up top. They are a resistor type spark plug, which most resistors nowadays, or most spark plugs nowadays are. They are factory spec'd at a 32mm gap, or at least that's what Denzil recommends. Now Hyundai recommends, I believe it's 37 or 38 to 42. Now that is 0.038 or 0.042. In metric, off the top of my head, I don't know. But it's a pretty wide gap. Okay, for boosted applications, spark plugs should be a little bit tighter, and for factory usage, the general thing that we've been seeing is in around that 0.32. So either Hyundai specs are wrong, or technicians are just getting them directly from Denzil and simply installing them, and there hasn't been any issues. But 0.32 is fairly recommended. It's a now what the spark denotes, okay, what that gap denotes is how long is the distance between this tiny little needle point to the other on these ones, tiny little needle point. That's the distance. Now, what that changes is basically the duration of the spark once it's left the coil. Okay, and too much boost and the spark won't be sufficient to ignite the fuel. That's called a blowout. So you'd have to tighten it. Too tight, however, and it's not burning long enough, which means it's not igniting as much fuel as it should, and you'll get sputter, okay? Which is basically your unburned fuel, and you get loss of performance and wasted fuel economy. Now the Denzil plugs are actually a really good plug. They are a dual iridium plug, which means that both the tip inside the porcelain is iridium, as well as the coating on the outside of the ground strap. Okay, and that's this thing out here. Now I'm not going to talk about how to read plugs, but knowing your spark plugs is kind of like getting a checkup, okay? By knowing how to read a spark plug, you're able to diagnose the basics of what's going on in your combustion chamber, a place that is typically not easily accessible in, I'd say, 99% of engines, unless it's like a small engine on a motorcycle or something, and even then. But it's very important that you learn how to read spark plugs, and there's different things that come into effect. The amount of ethanol in your fuel will affect what your spark plug looks like. If you run meth, how much, believe it or not, how much boost, and even the grade of fuel can all affect how the spark plug is read. Now, there is an ideal appearance for the spark plug, and that's what you're after, is that ideal appearance. Regardless of what you're using, there should be an ideal appearance. Now, if you notice a little bit of blue on the porcelain part down there, that's because you have methanol through your system. Alcohol burning will cause the porcelain to turn blue. So if you're not running meth and it's going blue, something really bad is happening in your engine. Alright, so that's talking about the factory ones. Now, the factory ones, just in case anybody was wondering, is a Denzil part number FK20HQR8, and that will be in the right there. Now, the ones that are a direct replacement for these, according to Denzil's guidelines, is an NGK VFKH20, which will also be down there. However, finding those plugs is actually really, really difficult, and I've had no luck finding them. And the factory Denzil ones are recommended for, I think, 60,000 miles. Okay, so roughly 100,000 kilometers, and they're a really good plug for stock usage, and they're actually a really good plug for quite a bit of power past stock usage. Now, the only reason at this point in time why I am changing my plugs is because my plugs have been damaged, and that is because there was a little bit of compression that fatigued one of my rings in my engine, and that weakened my ground straps, and now my ground straps will not hold a gap for longer than about 500 miles. So I'm replacing them in order to get away from that issue. Hopefully I won't have any more oil consumption that will cause that. Now, what I'm replacing them with is the NGK Iridium LFR6AIX11, which part number there. And then there's another number following it in the part lineup, and that is 018-4950-4. Now, according to multiple sources, and according to the specs of this spark plug, they're identical to these. Like, completely identical. They've got all the same specs, they've got the same heat range. Actually, that's not completely true. They're a little bit colder of a spark plug than the factory Denzos. But they're not what you would consider a full stage, because NGK actually and Denzil have different heat range numbering systems. Okay, so I guess you could say this is between half a step. Okay, and these ones come gapped out of the package at 0.042, which is too big for our engine, so I had to regap them. So these have been regapped to 0.032, and the reason that I'm doing that gap instead of anything tighter, like has been previously recommended in different sections of the forum, is because that's where I found on my engine before all the mishaps that I got the best combination of fuel economy and response. So I am going back to that gap in order to hopefully achieve similar effects. Now, based on the fact that this engine is now going to be more demanding towards efficiency, and there's going to be a little bit more air and a little bit more fuel, these plugs should be able to handle the combination quite well. One thing, continuing with the gap process, I want to talk about gapping them. Okay, now there are two recommended methods for how to gap a spark plug, and I really want to talk about these two methods because the one traditional gapping method I can't recommend to anybody to use, and I have used it before in the past on like lawnmowers and stuff like that, but I mean that's a single thumper type of engine, and I'm looking for, you know, basically that it's running and it's not sputtering all over the place. But doing it correctly the first time around when you're putting in new plugs is really important. Now there are two, like I said before, there are two main methods. You can use what's called a wire gapping tool, and what it is it is just these little hooks, And there are quite a few of these little hooks all over the place, and they're spec'd at different common gaps. So like I've got 0.5, 0.44, 0.42, or remember this is 0.042. I'm just skipping the 0 because it's just how I am, I guess. And it's got 0.33, 0.32, 0.31, all the way down to 0.25. Now, this is basically what I guess you would consider the industry standard tool. This is what the majority of people do use. And for the most part, it is a very accurate method of gapping. Now, because mine are already gapped and I don't like to touch them any more than I have to, I will touch the dirty one. So when I gapped this, before I took the engine apart, I had it at 0.32, and the gap is a little bit so the gap is between 0.035 and 0.040. So that's a pretty huge discrepancy in the gap. Okay. Now the easiest method, I'm going to use the 0.35 to show this. Okay, is when you're doing a field test. Okay, that's just testing to see which range you're in. Okay. See, that won't go through, and we don't push. We never push on a spark plug tip. Okay. The method I like to use is called the roll method, and now this isn't going to be completely accurate because obviously this just passes right through. But what you do is you start, and once you make a little bit of contact and you get a tiny bit of resistance, you give it a little bit of a roll, okay? And that roll means you're not dragging the loop across the surface, okay? And the reason I say that is because this is a round object, and you don't want to create a high spot or a low spot because iridium is not actually that durable of a material. Neither is platinum. Like, they're stronger than copper, but actually I'm not even sure on that. I'd have to look it up. But you give it a little bit of a roll, and then you gap accordingly. And I guess I should talk about the other tool in this. Now, you have, most of them come with this little tool here. And what it is the gap widening tool. Okay? You got two different methods. You got the hoop here that you can use, which I don't recommend. And you got these two little cuts here. Okay, these cuts sit right there, and you snug the face of it up against that contact point. Okay? And then you just roll back and you'll widen the gap. Okay? And then to close the gap, you can either press it with your thumb, but you don't want to press too much, and you can close it again because you don't want them to make contact, just FYI. The other method is the tap method, which is basically you hold your spark plug by this metal collar and you just tap it and it will close the gap. And this requires a little bit of finesse to do it this way. There is another tool that you can use that screws down onto it, and as you screw it down, it's got a little plunger that slowly closes the gap from the top. And that is the best, absolute best method of doing it because you can. It's a much more controlled method of doing it. So I don't happen to have one of those here. So I use the tap method, but I've been doing spark plugs for, well, not a whole lot, heck of a lot of time actually, because I don't really deal with gas engines. But the other method that you can use is the feeler gauge, okay? And the feeler gauge is what I would consider the most accurate. And you guys have seen me talk about these before. Now, the feeler gauge method is by far the best, okay? And the reason I say that it's the best is because if these are made correctly, they are like perfect, okay? So they have numbers on them and they tell you what their gap is. Now this one is in metric, so I had to convert it to do what I needed to do. But basically you take it, you line it up, and you slide it through, and you go until you've got the least amount of resistance. Now, this one isn't really set up, but you can actually compound these, add them together, and get a different thickness. Now that is way too thick. So you can minus out some distance. That's 0.1. And there you go. So if I add all these up, I'll know what the gap is. Okay. Now the only issue is some of these will come with oil on them, and they're not the best. That oil compound is not the best for combustion chambers. So it's not. I don't know if it's designed for it or not, but we don't want anything that we don't know about in our engines, right? So we gap the spark plugs. Now when you're installing your spark plugs, just a heads up, based on the style and the fact that we use an aluminum head, you don't want to torque the spark plugs any more than 21 foot-pounds. Okay? And the 17 to 21 foot-pounds is the max. Newton meters, I'll have that down at the bottom because I don't know it off the top of my head right now. But so we'll be torquing these in at 21 foot-pounds. Now, as for compounds, another much debated topic. Now, some people recommend that you do not use a compound when installing these. And what I'm talking about a compound is, it is the coating on this shaft, on the threads, in order to reduce torque while you're tightening it down. And you're using the crush of the seat in order to get the actual seal. Okay, that's all well and good, and it is completely fine. Now, which compound to use? I have always used a dab, and I mean a very light touch at the bottom of the threads of motor oil, of the motor oil that I like, and one that particularly burns very well because I don't want it fouling my plug. But you only use a very, very tiny amount, and that protects your aluminum cylinder head. It allows you to get the proper amount of torque because you're not fighting the resistance of the threads, and it using oil rather than anything else basically is something that the engine will naturally consume. It burns. So we're okay with using a little bit of oil. Do not coat the threads, okay? Because that's just going to dribble down and it's going to run the chance of fouling your plugs. As for don't use silicones, don't use graphite, don't use Loctite. Oh, do not use Loctite on your... No, never use Loctite, okay? I guess I should say, be more specific, don't use thread sealant. Either the white, blue, red, or the orange formula, don't use it. So, that is basically my basics on spark plugs. Now, you guys might have seen on the forum, but just in case you haven't, there will be a link in the description. I did do a review on those new E3 spark plugs, and they were garbage, so we're not using them again. And after the engine is built, I'll be doing a review on these NGK Iridiums. For my fellow Canadians, if you guys want an inexpensive alternative to the Denzils, because they're like $100 at the dealership, these Iridium ones I got at Canadian Tire. They were just generic on the shelf. They look like this. They have a 3-year guarantee, and I paid for them with my Canadian Tire money. It was $44 or something, less than $44 to get the spark plugs. So a lot cheaper than $100. So even if they last half the amount of time, I'm still ahead. So, but we'll be giving them a shot. We'll be testing them out, and NGK does have a really good reputation in the community, in any community. Basically, they're a really good spark plug. I'm going to get these installed. I'm going to get them torqued down because I'm done with the timing my rotating assembly, and we will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.